Welcome everyone to January Code Talk. We're doing a LAMP versus mean comparison, not really a throwdown. We'll get into reasons why, but we'll be talking about that with our three panelists up front. I'll let Chad introduce them as we get in, but we have Chad Cravens as our moderator from Open Source Systems. He also works in the flagship here and is quite busy all the time with lots of work and development, so we're happy to have him. I think I mentioned my name, but if I didn't again, Carolyn Finch. I'm the program manager at the Charleston Digital Corridor. I have a few announcements at the end for future Code Talks and for our next boot camp, which is on the 23rd for Hack Wars. So I'll leave you with that with a teaser. But without further ado, I'll introduce the panelists. We've got Tom Wilson from Jack Russell Software. Ron, I'm not going to try to say your last name. Code Camp instructor and CFC graduate, but also formerly of Blue Acorn. And also we have Sean Foster from Blue Acorn as well. So a little bit more about Tom. Obviously very passionate about software development. Main areas of focus, these are about 4 of the 20 plus things I saw off your LinkedIn. So pretty much master of many in the coding world. Next, Sean Foster, LAMP developer, coding for over 15 years now at Blue Acorn. Diverse background in education and technology. You taught 6th grade, 3rd grade?
I taught 1st grade, 3rd grade, and 6th grade.
Which is very helpful in our code camp classes for adults. It's like teaching children all over again.
And she's not joking, it actually
is. It's very helpful. And one of our lead instructors at Code Camp, right now teaching the Web 105 course on the full web stack. And then lastly, again, we have Ron, LAMP developer, very passionate about teaching and learning. He'll be teaching a class for us at Code Camp called Intro to Object-Oriented Programming, which starts up in February. So, and then lastly, Chad Cravens, again, founder of Open Source, very accomplished software engineer in cybersecurity and quality software development processes, another jack of all trades and master of many, I would say. So, all right, I'll let you guys do it.
Cool. All right. Well, welcome everybody. So I've done this a couple times where I just kind of act as the moderator and I work with our panel to really just kind of engage in discussion, but also help maybe translate a little bit because we may have a variety of knowledge and skill sets. I'm just kind of actually curious about if people here are familiar with LAMP versus mean, or if this is a new concept to most people here. Are people familiar with this more or less? Okay, cool. All right. So we've got a little bit of diversity in terms of what this is. So, so as the web has really kind of progressed over the years, we see a variety of technology stacks that are used to essentially implement web systems. So every time you log into a website, 15 years ago, we were pretty much guaranteed to have an Apache server, which is just a web or an HTTP server. But now people have really kind of started coming up with new ways to essentially handle requests, new programming languages, new databases, and that's essentially what the LAMP versus mean stack is it's the same technology stack, essentially they do essentially the same function, but technologically they approach it from a different perspective, right? So everything kind of comes with pros and cons, and that's what we're here today is to discuss the difference between these technology stacks and when you may want to use one over the other, or where one may be easier, or one can handle more people accessing the website, etc. But the LAMP versus the mean stack, so the LAMP stack is really essentially all you need to stand up a website that people can access. It comes with 4 components, Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP, right? And that's not the only stack. You can mix and match technologies in thousands of different ways, but that's a very common one. And then you have another one called mean, which stands for Mongo, Express, Angular, and Node. And so that's another suite of technologies that they kind of put together to build these websites. So I'm going to try to kind of moderate some discussion regarding the differences between the two. And again, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to ask our panelists. They're very nice people. I know them. So, all right. So what are we talking about? And actually, Tom, I'm going to go ahead and maybe start with you, sir, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Just maybe give us an overview of mean. So what does it mean to be mean in terms of the language and the database, the operating system, etc.? What are our options and what does it mean to be a mean stack?
Yeah, so the first thing is that it's JavaScript from end to end. So no context switching from working with your database all the way down to working with your front end. All the technologies use JavaScript and they use JSON to send the data back and forth. It does support an MV star architecture, so model view controller type of architecture, leveraging AngularJS and Express, and Mongoose is the ORM that most people use to access Mongo in Node, and it allows you to build your schemas and add your models and add your business rules on top of those models. And then Node.js, just access to over 100,000 plus NPM modules is just huge. It's the largest ecosystem at this point in time, and continues to grow in crazy rapid numbers. And then it's all open source, so you have all access to every single line of code in your stack to debug and to correct and move forward. So there's not a single element in your stack that you can't get access to. Okay.
And so, so when we talk about essentially the stack, right, like a technology stack, I think Carolyn's done a good job here of essentially iterating the aspects of a technology stack, being language, database, web server, and operating system. Now, Tom, can you kind of address, in terms of mean, what's the language? Well, you did address that, but the database and the web server, maybe just kind of explain it to some people where the mean stack fits into that.
Sure. MongoDB is the database server, and again, the query language, the storage mechanisms are JavaScript and JSON. The language is JavaScript. The sort of server-side engine is Node.js, and Node.js allows you to write JavaScript on the server and access the file system, access I/O, things like that. And Express is a minimal web framework that sits on top of Node. So it runs inside Node, and it makes it very easy to create RESTful interfaces and very easy to create server-generated HTML pages. And then Angular is sort of the front-end engine that sits on top of the browser and runs in JavaScript. And it gives you a way to create two-way data binding so that you can create templates for the DOM and then really bind those to your models so that they automatically change when your model changes, and your model automatically changes when the UI changes via user input. I think I covered them all.
Okay, cool. All right, so we'll jump to LAMP if nobody has any kind of questions about mean. And mean is fairly new, right? It's fairly new technology stack, and I've been working personally with Node for about a year now, and there's so much to learn. And like Tom said, it is a growing ecosystem, and it is incredible to see all of these little open source modules that people are creating. Very, very creative in terms of how they're addressing web development. It's pretty insane. So then we'll jump over to LAMP. I guess Bron or Sean?
Sure, I'll talk about it.
Sean? Okay. Yeah, if you can just, again, kind of what Tom did, but from a LAMP perspective.
Sure. So from a LAMP perspective, starting at the base, our web server is Apache. So that's the A in LAMP. That's basically an HTTP server that kind of handles requests and responses. And the language that's used in LAMP can be a few. Most primarily is PHP. That's the backend language. And then from a database perspective, we use MySQL database, or there can be others in there, but MySQL is the most prevalent. And then the operating system, because it's called the LAMP stack, we're primarily focusing on Linux. It can be other operating systems, but Linux is, I think, in our case, the most ideal to use with LAMP.
Cool. Okay. All right. So that kind of goes to show that we have a technology stack that gives us a web site, web system. There's essentially four components, which is why LAMP and mean both have 4 letters in them, right? So every letter is a representation of some sort of specific technology that it implements. So, all right, so this is kind of cute. It says, well, we're both fruit, but it's like comparing apples and oranges. So fruit, you can eat the fruit, and they both serve the same purpose, but they have different flavors and tastes and textures. So. All right, so do we want to talk about operating systems? Linux versus Windows. Like you said, this is a LAMP, so the L of LAMP would be Linux, right?
Yes.
Does it really matter? What's the differences? Can they both run on Windows and Linux?
I would say from our LAMP perspective, they can run on all of the operating systems. It can run on Mac, it can run on Windows, it can run on Linux. I would say for a LAMP setup, Linux is ideal. There are probably some benefits to using Linux. Some of those benefits would be stability, for one. Linux is very well known for its stability and its ability to run for long periods of time without crashing. I would say another benefit is security. Linux is based on Unix, so Unix was designed to be a multi-user platform, so Linux innately becomes good at handling multi-users or multiple users at a single time. Another benefit would be the hardware. So, for example, if you've ever used Windows, you know that you're constantly having to update it, right? Constantly having to update it to deal with new hardware that's coming out. Linux tends to be less update dependent, although if you're using newer like Ubuntu and Mint, there are a lot of updates, but generally what the server is running on is probably not going to be Ubuntu. It's probably going to be like CentOS or something like that. So it's more less dependent on updates. Definitely the total cost of ownership, I would say, is a huge benefit to Linux because it's free in most cases. There are enterprise editions that you could pay for, but even then I think you're paying less than you would for having to pay for all of the licenses and stuff that are involved in a Windows server. And then just the freedom of Linux, not having to be relying on specific vendors and paying for specific things. You can kind of mix and match things however you want and put things together in a way that works best for your company.
Cool. Ron, would you say that there is, for people who may not be familiar with Linux, would you say that there's a bit of a learning curve to get started in it?
So while Linux does have the same GUI as Windows does with files and folders and everything, the learning curve starts when you try to access the terminal, which is basically the heart of Linux, and the reason why it gives you most of its freedom is because you can use the terminal to do a bunch of stuff in a very short amount of time. The learning curve then starts only for the terminal and getting used to the whole I/O of the terminal, the applications you need to use through the terminal and stuff like that, or just maneuvering through the whole system. But other than that, it's mostly dealing with the technologies, because even when you use Linux or Windows, you still have to deal with MySQL the same way. You'd have to access the DB with the I/O. And so the learning curve would mostly be the terminal, which is really simple.
I'm just kind of curious for Linux users, for people who use it. Cool, nice, all right, awesome. So there's some people that have used Linux before. Cool. Tom, is there any sort of difference between operating systems from the me perspective?
No, really, the core of mean is Node.js, and in the early days it used to be focused to be optimized for Linux, but now with the 0.8 and 0.10 releases of Node, which are quite stable, they run just as fast in Windows as they do in Linux, and a large amount of the Azure team from Microsoft uses Node in the background to drive their cloud platform, and they obviously run their entire cloud on Windows. I think the other important distinction to make is that each platform, LAMP or mean, you can develop equally well in Windows as you can in Linux. So as a developer, you can work in Windows and build your apps with either Stack and then promote those into a production environment with Linux. And that workflow works just as well as if you were working in Linux and promoting to Linux production.
Cool. Okay. So both stacks were pretty operating system agnostic.
Yes.
Right. You can essentially install it and run it in both operating systems, which is cool. All right. Great. All right. Well, let's talk about the web server, because I think we have a lot that we can really talk about with this. And I do want to start with LAMP because Apache's been around forever. So let's talk about LAMP and the Apache web server. I mean, essentially, what is a web server? What does it do for us?
All right, so a web server basically handles responses and requests. So like a web server is taking in requests from the browser and then using the language in the database to kind of make interpretations and then send responses back to the user. So it's delivering the contents back to the user based on the request that was made. That's essentially
Okay.
in a simplified version. Of what it's
Okay.
doing.
So one thing that I know that the mean stack kind of really promotes is this idea of, Apache being highly dependent on threads, right? So essentially, every time a user requests a page from an Apache web server, a thread is spawned and that request is handled, right?
Yes.
Which back in the 90s was totally cool.
Right.
Has that changed with Mean?
Yes. So Node is an asynchronous architecture, which is interesting is that it runs in a single process. Whereas Apache, as it receives requests, it spins up threads. Node does not recognize threads. So it runs asynchronously, which basically means that it has an event loop. And every request comes in is sort of time sharing with that process. And when that process is idle, it allows more requests to come in. And just like Nginx is also another web server, but basically the benefit of that is that you get a very low consistent memory footprint as you grow users. Whereas Apache with its threading, as you grow users in your load, the more your memory requirements have to be addressed to handle all of those threads that are running. So Node gives you more concurrency with less memory at a very high level.
Ah, okay. So in terms of, I guess, comparing the two, would you say that Mean offers can handle more users, can handle requests more quickly? Why would a person choose Mean over Node for, like, let's say they are handling large amounts of users?
Right. So Mean can handle more users for the same amount of hardware. Again, but the response times aren't necessarily quicker than Apache, because really the speed of your server all deals with latency. And if you have servers, your application servers talking to your database servers, and then your application servers serving web pages, the speed is going to be that round trip from going from the browser to your app server to the database, back to the app server, back to the browser. So if you have slow connections between them, you could be actually slower than a LAMP stack that actually had faster connections. So I think the I/O is probably the biggest thing that controls your speed of your application. And and both of them solve the problem. They solve it really well. It's just different architecture.
So Sean and Ron, I assume you guys have worked with Apache before in terms of
Yes.
installation and configuration.
Mhm.
Can you tell me what that process is like to configure an Apache web server?
So basically for the Apache configuration, you have to deal with putting the site in your hosts file and the site's available file so that Apache recognizes it as a site. And then for the site itself, you have to set up a file called the htaccess, which has all the regexes and necessary status codes and whatnot to tell the server what files to give out to the browser whenever it accesses something. So the setup for Apache is basically getting the site to be recognized by the Apache server and adding a htaccess file to your file or folder, to your folder, and which tells Apache how to treat the whole folder and what to send out to the server whenever a request comes in.
And there are also configuration files to kind of tell it what modules to use depending on what your configuration is. What is it? Specific things like different types of languages and different types of things that you want Apache to be able to handle. There are configuration files to tell it what modules that you want to use.
On a scale of 1 to 10, how hard
Difficulty?
is it to manage an Apache configuration?
I would say 5. I mean, you do have to have some. I think the difficulty comes in understanding where everything is laid out in the operating system and also how it is all configured and works together. So I'm going to say 5, but I'm also talking from a perspective of somebody who has done it a few times, right? So, all right, I'll be lenient 6.
That's about the same, yeah.
There is some difficulty to setting up an Apache server.
Well, so Tom, you had mentioned before with the mean stack, it's different, right? Whereas the LAMP stack, you have to install a web server, and it essentially acts solely as a web server, but you had stated that the web server is actually kind of embedded in the language itself. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so Node.js gives you a nice API to your operating system level. So that allows you to run Node.js and manage I/O quite differently than other application stacks, so that you can use Node.js as your web server. You can use it as a DNS server. You can use it as a TCP server. So it allows, as far as configuration and things, it allows you to use JavaScript to do all of your configuration, to do all of your management, since everything is in JavaScript. You still have to do the same amount of configuration. It's just you're working within the same context that you're developing it.
Okay. So on a scale of 1 to 10, how difficult is it to manage a web server?
I think to spin up a web server, it's 0. To manage it, I think really with all the tools today and the cloud, I mean, you can really put a mean stack application into production using something like Heroku or using Amazon Web Services or Microsoft Azure, which in literally 2, right? The scale, super easy, just a couple of lines to do. And then the actual part of the management relies on those cloud providers. So if you're leveraging their service, then it's super easy. If you're doing it yourself, then it's going to move up to a 6 or a 7.
Okay, cool. All right, so kind of 2 different approaches for the web server, right? I guess let's talk a little bit about the database, because we could spend hours just talking about this concept. But Mongo versus MySQL. John, what's the 30,000 foot view differences of Mongo and MySQL?
Well, from my SQL perspective, I'd say the fact that it's a relational database is kind of a big difference from what I understand, I believe.
Okay.
So relational meaning that it works, the way that it's structured is different. It's more based on tables and columns and rows, and relationships are created within those tables through different like foreign keys and primary keys and things like that. So it's able to, from my SQL perspective, for me, I think it's kind of organizationally more or easier to understand for me, to be able to look at data and say, okay, well, this is the table, this is a specific, like users is a table, and then within that I can get information about each user.
Okay. Tom, do you have anything to add from that from the Mongo side about the differences?
Yeah, well, Mongo is schemaless, which means that you don't have to commit to how you organize your your data day one, right? And you do not have to run migrations to change your schema. It really puts the control of the schema inside the code, whereas MySQL, you sort of have that control of schema in two places. You have it in MySQL in the structure of tables and rows, and then you have it in your code in the structure of probably some sort of object relational mapper, right? So that your code can because your code understands objects a lot better than it understands tables and rows. So I think the big difference for me is especially if you're building an application and you need to modify your schema quite often because business changes or needs change, stakeholders' needs change. Mongo presents a much appealing type of workflow to do that.
Okay. So one of the big differences being schemaless versus having to define your schema up front, right?
Mhm.
And as you had mentioned, Tom, working with a relational database like MySQL, the code, it's essentially hard to map the data in a structured database to objects in an object-oriented language. Now, would you consider Node to be object-oriented?
Well, JavaScript really allows you to use several different language styles. So you can use an imperative style or a top-down approach, or you can use object-oriented, and that was really what I was alluding to with the Mongoose NPM module. It basically gives Mongo an object relational mapper on top so that you can use your models in an object-oriented way. But of late, there's a lot of libraries and modules in Node that allow you to do functional programming and functional reactive programming as well, which is really exciting to have a language that's flexible to take different paradigms, and again, you still know the same language.
Okay, interesting. So Mongoose is a technology, or essentially a module that somebody developed that allows your JavaScript or your Node application to work with your Mongo database.
Correct.
Essentially, right?
Right. So basically, when I was talking about data binding, two-way data binding, you have sort of a data binding concept between your persistent store and your application, right? So when your application modifies data, you want that to go to your persistent store. And when your persistent store's data changes, you want that to come back to your application. Mongoose is that bridge that allows you to change data, and then it'll figure out all of the communication process to get that to the persistent store. And then when the persistent store changes, it will send that information back to your application so that you always have a current record of the data inside your application.
Very nice. Okay. So MySQL, I don't know if a lot of people, from what I understand, MySQL is not my as in MySQL, right? So SQL stands for Structured Query Language, which is essentially a standard for how you query relational data, right? Which probably sounds kind of nerdy for people who've never worked with that. But essentially what that does is that allows you to say, okay, well, if I have a bunch of records, how do I write code that I can get access from all those records, right? And if I want to find out specific things. So if I want to find all the users who are over the age of 30, how do I essentially structure a query that does that, right? So SQL is kind of a standard. Now MySQL, the developer, I believe his daughter's name was Mai, and so that's why it's called MySQL. And when Oracle acquired the MySQL database, he actually forked it and spun off a new project called MariaDB. And so now you can use MariaDB rather than MySQL if you want to stay away from the talons of Oracle. So MySQL is based on that structured query language, right? Which, I mean, since the 70s has really kind of been, under development, and there's all kinds of different relational databases.
Yes.
And it offers a thing called ACID compliance with transactions and supports transactions, right? And from what I understand, Mongo does not support multi-transaction, atomic transactions, right?
It does support atomic, but it is not ACID compliant. That's correct.
Okay. So why is that, and is that a big deal from an application developer's perspective?
Well, the one reason why Mongo is not ACID compliant is because it doesn't have tables and rows, which also results into it not having joins or being able to query multiple tables at the same time and get data from between those tables to be under one single transaction, which is the other thing. MySQL can do multiple transactions and treat them as just one single transaction, meaning that you can do a select from one table, join them to another one, do some other wheres and conditions on there, which I'm sure you can also do with conditions you can also do with Mongo. But that's one of the bigger things that Mongo doesn't have is the joins, which makes it mostly non-ACID compliant.
Mm-hmm.
And I think from like a data integrity standpoint, that's a valuable, like transactions in general are valuable. It's being able to enforce that the entire transaction is either going to work or it's not. And if it doesn't, you don't want pieces of the data to have been changed and then potentially damage or corrupt that data through the transaction if some of it broke. So the idea is that the entire transaction either happens or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, then it all gets rolled back and nothing happens.
Okay.
And to that point, I guess Mongo is a document storage persistent data store, where MySQL is relational. So oftentimes in your application, you may have a rich object, right? You may have a widget that has several components. And in MySQL, you may store widgets in a table and components in the table and relate those. Whereas Mongo, you would create one document per widget and then have an array or a collection inside that document of components. So when you're storing that document, you're making one call, one transaction to store all of that data. And whereas MySQL, you have to make a call to store the widget and a call to store each record of the components. So that's why you really need to be able to wrap transactions in MySQL, and that's why it's not as important in Mongo, depending on your case. Obviously, if you have a highly relational data structure, then Mongo would be a really bad choice because of that ACID compliance requirement.
Okay. And why do you think it is that the developers of Mongo kind of forego that ACID compliance piece? Is there a reason for that, or is it just?
Well, I think it's because their use cases are more document oriented, right? So the main content management system use case is that you have an account, and then you have underneath that account a blog, right, or some sort of page that you want to update, and then underneath that you may have comments, right? So that common use case really bodes well for Mongo, where the account could be your database, and that collection is that document or that post, and inside that collection or that document is a collection of comments. So Mongo fits that pattern really well. And the amount of work you have to do to get up and running with Mongo for that kind of use case versus MySQL is a lot less.
Mm-hmm. So I guess kind of moral of the story is that there's a lot of differences between database choices. There's a lot of research that one would need to do in order to really kind of make the right decision,
Yes.
right, in terms of which stack that they choose. Now, question though. I know we're talking about LAMP and mean. But is it possible to use Node against MySQL and Mongo against PHP and Apache and vice versa? Can we mix and match technologies here?
Go ahead.
No, that's it. I was about to say, yeah, it's possible because basically you need is the ORMs to go from the language to the database. And I can't off the top of my head remember the ORM I used for PHP and Mongo, but I know I've done it before, and it's. Again, with an ORM, it's basically a way of telling the database what to do without using database as a language. So you're using, like, if you want a PHP ORM, which we mostly use MySQLi or PDO, and it basically you can just tell the database like join these two or bring me the stuff from this guy without telling select star from or join from. And that's basically why it's possible to switch or mix and match databases, is that you have an ORM that handles all the transactions between the two.
Yep, and Node.js has several drivers for relational databases, MySQL, Microsoft SQL Server, you name it, they have. And the interesting thing is there are a lot of them that are written in native JavaScript. So there's no compiled drivers, which updating your code from different versions really makes that super easy to do. And then on top of that, there's several ORMs that sit that connect to SQL databases as well.
I always wonder where people have the time to do all this stuff. It's just incredible. So.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So we talked a little bit about that. The fact that Mongo has a flexible data model, so you can, it's documented, it's document oriented, and document doesn't mean like Word document. Okay, so document is a data structure that they use, and it's flexible in terms of if I've got my application deployed with relational databases, it's very difficult to manage that structure, because if you need to add a column or a table or create some sort of relationship that binds the two, then you essentially have to completely rewrite your schema. And they have, what was it called, Liquibase? Yeah, for essentially managing those schema changes over time so that you can apply those schemas. So it's like a version control for your schemas, essentially. Whereas Mongo, if you have a document, 300 documents, and document 301 you have to add a column to or an attribute to, you can essentially do that on the fly. So it's flexible in that sense. But whereas MySQL is ACID compliant and supports transactions. So when people talk about the cloud too, when people talk about the cloud, to me it means essentially two things: virtualization and distributed computing, right? So from a Mongo MySQL perspective, can both of those be distributed? Can both of those support essentially vertical scaling or horizontal scaling rather than just vertical scaling?
I think so.
Yeah, Mongo, was built, and Mongo sort of means humongous is part of the name of Mongo, so that it can support a humongous amount of data, and they really built it to scale horizontally and deal with data needs of this cloud era.
Cool. All right.
I know that we have seen
Nice
issues with
Okay.
MySQL. I mean, as MySQL grows significantly large, their issues begin to happen, I think, that I've seen, at least from my own experience with it. I mean, so again, it's going to depend on the setup and how everything is structured, but we have seen issues with that.
Sure. And from what I understand, from when you distribute a MySQL cluster, that whole concept of transactions, incurs what's called a two-phase commit, which can essentially incur a lot of cost and waiting, on the system. Where, Mongo, you don't have that. Well, but I will tell people, you can actually. So whereas MySQL, you can have atomic multi-transaction commits or whatever. With Mongo, you can actually implement a two-phase commit yourself. And so I think we had a Mongo class. Is anybody in my Mongo class? Yeah, we did that in our Mongo class. So we actually implemented a two-phase commit protocol, but it's something that we had to develop ourselves in the database rather than letting MySQL do that for us. So, all right. Okay, I guess we can talk a little bit about the structured query language versus an API-based database and the CAP theorem. Okay, so probably not too much on the CAP theorem, but when so I don't know if you guys would agree with me, but it was like, probably 5 or 6 years ago, it really seemed like these databases, distributed databases, were like just coming. I mean, you got CouchDB that popped up, and then Mongo, and then, you had all these databases that are coming up, and you had this thing called the CAP theorem, which was a white paper that was released that essentially they proved that you want consistency, availability, and partition tolerance in a database. You want all three, but you only get two, right? And so they essentially kind of proved that mathematically that was the case. So when we talk about these different databases, you can think of a triangle where each of these databases kind of fits between one of those two of the three, right? It's kind of pick two. But we won't really talk much about that. But there's a lot of information on the internet about the CAP theorem. But one thing I think it's maybe kind of important to talk about is how you query it. Whereas MySQL is, you use the SQL query language, whereas Mongo is API based.
You actually use a query language. It's just in JSON. It was proprietary to Mongo, but several NoSQL vendors now are adopting it. Like CouchDB is going to be adopting it, and I think RethinkDB uses it as well. Again, so it's starting to become more of a standard than just a specialized query language for Mongo.
What I do like about SQL though is that it's very human language oriented. It's very, so it's, select monkey from animal where color is purple, right? I mean, it's kind of
It's declarative.
easily readable.
Very declarative.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's why I guess you said, Tom, that term NoSQL is relates to the databases that essentially don't use SQL, as that's why they call them NoSQL, right? Okay.
Right.
So people may see that term a lot, right? NoSQL. That refers to databases who don't use SQL to query.
That's correct.
Okay, but they still do have a query language.
Yes.
Right, okay. All right. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the languages. So I'm going to try to pick on JavaScript real quick. From what I've heard through blogs and stuff, JavaScript is slow. Tell us more about that.
Well, that's been true in the past. I mean, it's a dynamic language, and it's going to always be slower than a compiled language, right? There's some really, really smart people that work on what's called JavaScript engines, and these are engines that drive our browsers. And if you've noticed in the last 3 or 4 years, our browser speed has increased significantly, right? Chrome uses a JavaScript engine called V8, and they have shown use cases where the JavaScript code has really run near as fast as the compiled native code. So they continue to make leaps and bounds. Firefox has an incredible demo where they're running a first-person shooter game in JavaScript from the Unity 3D engine, and they actually transpiled the bytecode of the Unity game engine into JavaScript, and it runs in the browser, and it's pretty impressive. So I think that is more of a myth now.
Okay. Oh, no, you mentioned compiled versus non-compiled code. Is PHP compiled?
No. PHP is a scripting language, but it's kind of in the same respect. It's being interpreted by a compiled interpreter.
Okay, cool. So Tom had mentioned before, you can kind of choose your paradigm with JavaScript. PHP, is it object-oriented?
PHP is very object-oriented. I mean, it does have classes. If you're familiar with programming languages like C and C++ and Java, you are working with classes. You are able to actually create abstract objects. Abstract classes. You can create interfaces. So you have the ability to kind of build that whole object-oriented structure with PHP.
Okay, cool. Are they both typeless?
For the most part.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Now,
You can-
your personal opinion again, scale of 1 to 10, what's the difficulty, 10 being the most difficult, to learn how to program in the language?
As a beginner, or?
Sure.
Sure, as a beginner, I would say probably maybe a 4. I mean, PHP is very logical in the sense that it follows the same kind of structure, I think, that like Java and C++. So if you understand the concept of like building an object and things like that, if you can understand what a variable is, if you can understand what a function are. It all kind of follows the same rules as most other programming languages. So overall, I don't think it's difficult to learn.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I agree.
So one thing I think is really interesting with JavaScript, and Tommy talked about this a little bit before,
Sure.
that I think maybe kind of might add a little bit in terms of the learning curve for JavaScript is that whole event-driven model and that essentially event loop that runs in JavaScript. So can you talk a little bit about the learning curve for this?
Yeah, so I think if you are used to classical languages like Java or C# or even PHP, JavaScript is sort of different. JavaScript is a little bit different the way it's architected, and you really have to think in terms of async instead of synchronous mindsets, and that can be a bit challenging to introduce those async concepts and have to understand that maybe it looks in my code like this line's going to execute right here, but it's actually not. It's going to go and do stuff, and then it's going to come back and execute. So that can really trip a lot of beginners up.
And scoping in JavaScript.
And scoping.
Definitely trips people up a lot.
Okay. So scale 1 to 10, Tom, what would you?
I think it's sort of 2. It's a 3 to get up and going and easy and feel like you're doing something, but then it's like an 8 or 9 to get deeper. I feel like I'm still learning JavaScript today, so I think it just constantly there's constantly something new with the language, something that you could do and you couldn't do before.
It's kind of interesting how just 6-7 years ago, JavaScript was some puny little language that you used to validate forms on an HTML page, and it's just amazing to see it kind of mature and grow into this thriving community and a very mature language that's capable of handling some of the most stuff.
And the thing I love and hate about it is that there are like 18 different ways to create an object.
Yeah. So JavaScript doesn't
It's an
really
exaggeration. There aren't really 18.
well, it doesn't really support classes,
Right.
So I've been working a lot in a language called CoffeeScript, where you essentially can create classes, and it's just interesting to see how CoffeeScript compiles that JavaScript into some magic that essentially implements inheritance, encapsulation, and things like that. So very interesting. Okay, cool. Anybody have anything else they wanted to say on the language? No, PHP versus JavaScript. Okay.
I mean, if you're coming from a C-based language, then honestly learning PHP is pretty easy. The only difference that I've found is that you put $signs in front of your variables. And then obviously some of the built-in functions and stuff are different. But the learning curve coming from another language that is C-based is easy. If you are learning JavaScript, if you've learned JavaScript first and then you try to go into PHP, it's a completely different realm.
Cool. All right, well, let's talk about frameworks. First, kind of a discussion on what a framework is. Who wants to talk about what a framework is?
I mean, a framework is essentially kind of like a wrapper. Basically, it's a series of tools built around something to kind of add functionality to it, right? To make it easier to use, to make the way that you access information or the way that you access something easier, I think.
So you say, would it help a developer reduce the amount of code that
Right.
he or she has
Yes.
to write? Okay,
Yeah.
cool. And so what are our options for frameworks, Tom?
There's several web frameworks in Node. Probably the 2 most popular is Express and Happy, HAPI. Both of those are the most popular, and essentially they do the same thing and just have different preferences. Express is declarative, but very conventional. So it depends on conventions on how you organize your code, whereas Happy is very configuration driven. So you actually write configuration files to drive your web framework in code.
Cool. Okay. And then for PHP, what are our options for frameworks?
Wanna talk about some?
Yeah. So some of the ones we have up there are K, Zend, and Symfony. The one that they use a Blue Acorn is Magenta, which is built on top of the Zend framework. And the Zend and KPHP, and they just add the MVC functionality to PHP. So while you could code your own models using controllers in PHP, you can use the framework, like Sean said, to make it easier for you to do that. So for Zend, you can just make folders for controllers, models, and views, and they'll be handled as such when you put the code in there.
And one of the huge benefits of the frameworks is that they've built all of the structures necessary to kind of access database information and all of that stuff. It's all kind of handled for you, so you're really just calling methods that exist within the framework to get information.
Okay. So what are some of the most popular? You say Zend?
Then,
is what you all are pretty familiar
that's
with.
a pretty good list of the most popular right there.
Cool. All right.
Yeah,
And so people can go online and learn more about these frameworks.
yeah, definitely.
Cool. All right. Learning curve for newbies. 1 to 10. For Zend, let's say.
7.
7. Okay.
Yeah.
So it's fairly amount.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to Zend and a lot of different elements to learn, so I would say 7.
Cool. Sound for Express? Could you put a number on it?
I would say around 4, with the caveat of really understanding HTTP and REST architecture. So those are sort of probably more important concepts to understand, but once you understand that, Express is super easy to get.
Cool. Very cool. And like you said, it's declarative, which is probably leads to its simplicity, right?
Yeah.
Understanding. All right, cool. All right, so we've got about 5 minutes. I guess we can leave some time for questions too. But LAMP has been around forever, and in fact, from what I understand, Facebook started out as a LAMP stack, right?
Yes.
And from what I understand too, they also compile their PHP into a compiled language C, right? So they convert their PHP to C, and then they compile their C, which does provide a performance boost. And from what I read, it was about 30% performance boost. Now, whatever that means, because when you talk about performance for computers, there's like all kinds of variables, right? So there's all kinds of conditionals and ifs of, when you talk about the performance of an application, right? But it's pretty much generally supported by most web hosting services, very popular.
Yes.
And I mean, would you feel comfortable telling people this is a good way to break ground into web development?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's time tested. It's been, proven over many years. You say forever, but I'm actually older than, so that's okay. It was not forever, but it's been around a long time, right? I mean, so it's been proven over time to be effective. It works. I mean, it has its pluses and negatives, but I think it's definitely a viable option when you're trying to build a website.
And most importantly, since it's been around for so long, you can go online and find a ton of resources on any of the troubles that you have with it. Like I know I've had some trouble setting up a LAMP stack at some point, and with whatever small errors I have, they have been answered. Because it's been around for so long, like when I tried to set up a mean stack and I had it was a very minuscule error was my problem. But still, I couldn't find a lot on it because it's so new, and so yeah. You definitely have a bunch of resources to help you when you're trying to set up a LAMP stack.
Well, then that, and the community, the support, and the documentation is, I think, its strong suit, LAMP's strong suit, because it has been around forever. There's so many people who have done it, so you're really never alone when you are trying to set up a LAMP stack.
Yeah, and I think it largely depends on, again, understanding your use case. If you're trying to get content to the internet, there's probably not anything any easier than a LAMP stack to get content into the internet. The mean stack, I think its sweet spot is more an application approach, right? So if you're putting an application for people to connect and collaborate on, the mean stack offers a really nice use case for that.
Sure. Okay, cool. And I guess another key difference that we had here on the side is mean. Tom, you said this before, and I just think it's pretty amazing, is that you use the same language on the client or server. Pretty much the whole stack is based on JavaScript, right?
Right.
Which you talked about has really matured. It's not slow like people will say it is. It's another option out there for people to use with different paradigm in terms of how you develop on it. So yeah, so that's fantastic. And so non-blocking. Oh, we talked about the threaded nature of Apache, the event-driven nature of Node, how it's non-blocking, etc. So I think we're like about a minute, but we probably do want to have questions for people. Anybody has anything?
On the MongoDB document store, if you've got a large document and you just want to change part of it, do you have to resubmit the whole document?
That's a good question. I think you would have to resubmit it. You can do some internal updates, atomic updates, so that you can send some partials, but I'd have to get back to you on that one.
No, you can update pieces of the document. You can update just one part of it, or you can update the whole thing, whatever you want. Like you can pull out just one piece, change it out, and then you're done. You're on your way.
Yeah, good. Yeah, that's actually a really good question. And you're exactly right.
Hey, so I've come from the compiled language world. I'm a Java programmer, and one of the things that I do like about it is the inherent safety, the type safety behind it. It's going to prevent me from doing something really stupid, like putting like a double in a string. Is that a concern with both of these types of languages, or are there strategies to prevent yourself from doing that kind of stupid thing?
With JavaScript, there are several different pre-compiled languages that you can use on top. Microsoft has a language called TypeScript, which is like a JavaScript, but it forces you to use types. So you could use that and pre-compile into JavaScript, which will give you some type protection. Same thing with CoffeeScript to an extent, and Dart is another sort of variation of JavaScript that are Google's version of what JavaScript should be, right? That gives you some type control, and it compiles down into JavaScript.
And from a PHP perspective, I mean, typing, you don't have to declare a type, but exceptions will be thrown if the type doesn't actually work within the context of what you're doing.
So it's basically you'd have to figure that out, like debug time, like
Yeah.
I did something stupid. Let me.
Yeah.
Okay.
And you can typecast just like you can in compiled languages, things like that.
Because I'll often find myself having to type tests against objects, right? It's like in Java, something is an instance of or whatever. And then, yeah.
And that's a test, that's a check that you can do within your code too. You can say if it's a type of whatever, and then.
But nothing like your IDE will say, hey, you did something stupid here.
Right,
You
your
kinda have to
IDE
get
won't
in and
tell
run.
you until it blows up in your face. Yes.
Yeah, runtime errors will get
Yeah.
you. Cool. So I also want to just mention too, I mean, mean and lamp are just common, right? They're common frameworks, and that's why they stuck kind of stamps on them. But for example, I have a little project I'm working on that I call Frankenware, where I'm using like a C++ embedded web server with, it's an Angular-based single page app, and both a PostgreSQL relational database with a Mongo document-oriented database in the background too. So you can mix and match however you want these different flavors, just kind of depending on what your needs are, what your requirements are. So you're not married to mean or lamp. You know, you can use it however. So cool. Does anybody have any
Questions?
Yeah. Close it up.
I guess one final thing, I think Tommy touched on it a little bit, but do we have a clear winner here, or are there better instances to use one versus the other? Is that kind of what it comes down to?
Yeah, I think it ultimately depends on your situation, what it is that you're trying to achieve, and the amount of traffic that you're planning to get. There's a lot of different variables, so I don't know that there's a clear winner. I think there are better situations for each.
I agree.
I think too also, you know, technology alone, it also really kind of depends on what your organization is capable of working with. I mean, if you've got a team of 20 developers, you're like, all right guys, we're going to start doing Node. I mean, it's a lot of time to get, you know, all those guys and girls up to speed on that, you know. So the project, I mean, you know, so cost, time, and budget, always a concern as well. So, I mean, you shouldn't always have to rely on the knowledge of somebody, but it's also a consideration.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Oh, no.
Oh, was there more? Sorry.
Yeah, would it be possible to quickly address the differences in concerns over security between implementing with PHP and Node.js?
I think both of the concerns are the same, right? So really, the security of the internet, I think both stacks use, you know, the SSL encryption, and then the encrypting your data at rest is largely done by your operating system. So most of your security threats are both for mean and LAMP are the same.
Well, SQL injection, I think, is probably one that you should consider too, where
Sure.
it's different architecture for the databases. So the mean, you really don't have to address SQL injection because you're not using SQL. So that would probably be one too that I can think of off the top of my head. So, cool. All right, we'll wrap it up.
All right, thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Appreciate it. Really quick, so next month, we'll do another kind of biz talk, if you will, on Kickstarter campaigns. We've got Disley Union coming, ISI, and Moondog Animations. So each of them has run different Kickstarter campaigns, and to compare and to look at why they chose to use Kickstarter, and there are actually some different reasons for doing it besides just raising money. So that should be interesting. In March, we're doing a mobile integration code talk. Blanking on, oh, in April, we're back again with Tom Wilson will be here, and Jason Finney brought from Boomtown to discuss micro services. Yeah, so I'll let you discuss that. Haven't even touched that. We do have a Hack Wars this month for a boot camp. It'll be January 23rd. It's next Friday. We have a couple spots still available. Henry Link will be here from Lifecycle Engineering. He's going to run through some demos and actually get the students to be working on an actual hack on his machine. So if you want to attack Henry, now's your chance. Nice guy. But that should be good. It's $125 for regular students. If you are a student and you're enrolled at a school currently, you can get a half off using code 50. So come to that. Women in Tech, so if you're interested in volunteering for an all-girls coding club, we've got a training session this month with, thanks to Google and their CS First program. We're reaching out to some schools in the next couple of weeks or so, so hopefully we'll get started to teach young girls how to code starting in February, and no experience required. Sorry guys, it's women only for this one. I think that's it. I-5K, we still have a couple tickets available. I think we've got about 15 or less out of 800, so if you wanted to come to that and haven't registered yet, feel free to jump on that today. It should be gone by the weekend, actually. That's on our website, i5k.com. That's it. Thanks guys for coming. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks.